starting the recording now. And all audience members agree to the possibility of appearing on these recordings by virtue of attending the event and or participating in the event. I hope this won't be the case, but if there are any inappropriate verbal or written communication, individuals will be removed from the session. And we're just asking that we as a community hold each other accountable for maintaining a space of safety, accountability, respect, and inclusion. If you do have questions for the panelists, which I hope you all do, please type them in the chat. And please note as well that some questions may be combined with others or not addressed due to time constraints. Next, I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. Since time immemorial, this land has been occupied and cared for by diverse Indigenous nations. This land is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I offer my gratitude to these nations and any other nations, recorded and unrecorded, who have diligently cared for this land. Toronto is also the site of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land in a spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. As we begin our discussion today on the theme of sustainability, I invite all of us to reflect on the teachings of this treaty and how it might inform our work. Finally, I also want to express that a land acknowledgement is a moment of pause and gratitude, but it should also be a wake-up call for settlers like myself and many of you to remember how historical and ongoing Indigenous dispossession is what allows us to be here today. Indigenous scholars and activists warn that land acknowledgements, especially when recited within elite institutions like universities, run the risk of further entrenching complacency rather than action. A few lines recited at the start of an event, and then we go on about our days. This then leaves unjust and unsustainable relationships with the land and Indigenous nations and peoples virtually unchanged. So with this in mind, I want to invite all of us now to pull out a notepad or a piece of paper and answer two questions quietly for yourself. First, what is one thing that the land where you live provides that you are grateful for? Second, what is one thing that you will do after this event to learn about and support the Indigenous nations on whose land you reside? If you are joining us from outside Toronto today, please do feel free to visit nativeland.ca for more information on Indigenous territories, languages, and treaties. So I will just provide 1 minute of silent reflection, and please just answer these two questions for yourself. What one thing that you are grateful for, which the land provides, and one thing that you will do after this event to learn about and support Indigenous nations. All right, thank you. And please don't feel that you are limited to 1 minute if you need more time later. So without further ado, about the panel, I'm so excited to get started. The 17 United Nations SDGs were adopted in 2015 as a global framework to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. Since then, they have become central to the University of Toronto's approach to sustainability as they reflect the diverse and wide-ranging approach to sustainability that U of T values. The 17 goals are interlinked and have championed the notion that sustainability is both an environmental and a social concept, and thus requires a holistic approach. Through implementing the 17 SDGs into U of T's sustainability initiatives, U of T recognizes the importance of having an inter and transdisciplinary view of sustainability. In December of 2020, U of T hosted a 17 SDG Rooms event to discuss, analyze, and innovate new ways to advance U of T's commitment to the goals. At this event, over 120 participants were assigned to one of 17 virtual rooms, each focusing on one of the 17 SDGs. The participants were then invited to explore ideas on how to advance the SDGs in teaching, research, and community engagement, both within U of T and beyond. And this was the first event of its kind to be hosted at U of T, representing an ambitious step in the process of further incorporating the SDGs within the university. Today's event will build off of the 17 Rooms event with the goal of exploring what has happened since then and showcasing a few of the SDG related initiatives that have taken place and hearing about next steps. Today's event features a panel of 4 members of the U of T community, each bringing unique perspectives and experiences relating to the SDGs and the implementation of sustainability related initiatives. I'm so pleased to welcome Nakota Foster, who's the Associate Director, Sustainable Development, Office of the Vice President, Research and Innovation at UTSC, Patricia Escobar, Sustainability Manager and Sustainability Office at UTSC, Simon Pratt, Director, Research Strategy and Excellence, Office of the Vice President, Research and Innovation, and finally, Gwen Burrows, Executive Director, International, Office of the Vice President, International. We're so fortunate to have these panelists with such wide-ranging experiences here to discuss recent sustainability-focused initiatives, including the SDG Institutional Strategic Initiative, or ISIE, UTSC's version of the 17 Rooms event, U of T's SDG Conceptual Report and Times Higher Education Impact Rankings, and international partnerships. Each of the panelists will have 5 to 7 minutes to give a presentation on their area of expertise, and this will be followed by an opportunity for Q&A with the panelists. And the goal will be to spark a discussion on these initiatives as well as brainstorm for next steps. Before we do begin, I just want to reiterate our appreciation that all of you have taken the time out of your schedule to come and support such an important event. A central goal at U of T is to make sustainability a central aspect of the U of T identity, and your engagement inspires future work like this at U of T. So our first panelist, Nakota Foster, is strongly committed to advancing the goals of health equity and advocates for the removal of barriers to improving the health and well-being of the most vulnerable members of society. Nakota is currently working on completing her doctoral degree in health studies at McMaster University. She received her Bachelor of Public Affairs and Policy Management from the Arthur Kroger College of Public Affairs and Policy Management at Carleton University, and a Master's of Public Health from the Dalalana School of Public Health right here at U of T. Further, Nakota is also an ad hoc member of the American Red Cross Scientific Advisory Committee's Disaster Preparedness and Health Sub-Council. Today, Nakota will be discussing the SDG ISIE, which was one of the direct outcomes of the 17 Rooms event. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. I'm just going to share my screen. All right. Okay, so thanks again for, thanks everyone again for having me here this afternoon. I'm very pleased to be with you at the CECS's Adams Sustainability Celebration to very briefly introduce you to the SDGs at U of T initiative, which, as Amanda highlighted, is an institutional strategic initiative, or ISIE for short, that focuses on advancing SDG-related research at the university. So I wanted to first just to start off to give you a very brief definition of what an ISI is. I know sometimes we get really, we're very focused in our area and sometimes we don't take time out to just kind of define what these are. So an institutional strategic initiative is really a large scale, high impact interdisciplinary research area that really has the potential to transform lives. The mandate of the ISI office, and it's a very small team, is really to launch, grow, and sustain large-scale interdisciplinary strategic research networks that, one, address significant challenges or ask complex questions that require the integration of multiple fields and disciplines. So the SDGs really fits this category. Includes faculty members from at least 3 academic units or divisions as defined by the School of Graduate Studies. So examples include humanities, social sciences, physical sciences, life sciences, and also among others. And also, when feasible, has meaningful tri or cross-campus participation. So after the 17 Rooms event, and even before the event, we really saw that, of course, universities and other higher education institutions have a very critical role to play in terms of helping society to implement and advance the SDGs through research. The University of Toronto is world-renowned for groundbreaking cross-disciplinary research, but one of the great things that the 17 Rooms event did was really highlight the fact that advancing the SDGs will require support for the full spectrum of research approaches that are transdisciplinary, inclusive, pragmatic, as well as transformative. So after the event, it was recognized that research at the university on sustainability, or the SDGs, is quite scattered and sometimes not even labeled as such. The university, even though it's very large, the structures are siloed, and so transdisciplinary collaborations that use the SDGs as a framework are not easily enabled. So one of the recommendations that came from the 17 Rooms event was basically to create a committee that could maintain the momentum started by the event, and that could also help to shape the university's actions on the 17 SDGs. So a proposal was put together and submitted to the ISI office for funding to support the development process of an ISI that will be focused on the SDGs, or SDGs related research more specifically, and that became the SDGs at U of T Initiative, even though we're very early in the development process. So the ideas that were generated from the 17 Rooms discussions were very instrumental in informing the early conceptualization of the SDGs at U of T Initiative. And the initiative itself aims to create a strategic plan that builds on existing research initiatives, forms new interdisciplinary and global partnerships, as well as provide a map for advancing the UN SDGs at the university. We are co-sponsored by the Associate Vice President and Vice Provost Strategic Initiative, as well as the Vice President International, who is Joe Wong. And we have 2 academic leads. So Professor Mark Cadot, who is a professor of the biological sciences at UTSC, as well as Erica Di Ruggiero, who is a professor at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health. And with them, we work together with a steering committee comprised of faculty members from across all 3 campuses, as well as a student advisory committee, again, both undergrad as well as graduate students. One of the things we really wanted to ensure was that the strategic plan not only includes or reflects the voices or the priorities of the U of T faculty, but also that the student voices were also represented. We're going through a process of engagement and consultations. Well, that's one of the key focus of the strategy development process. We started this process really just last September. And, together with the steering committee and the student advisory committee, we've been able to make significant, progress in terms of kind of defining the strategies, vision, mission, and priorities. We have also started doing the consultations, and this is really a key focus of ours because it's very important for us to to gain buy-in and have the university community engaged in the process. And so one of the objectives for the engagement consultation is really to gather feedback on the proposed priority areas and the research agenda that will outline to address the SDGs, and also to gain broad support from faculty, students, and staff, and then of course to identify those opportunities for alignment and synergies. We recognize that through the consultation process, there's already a lot that's happening at the university related to sustainability, research related to sustainability, as well as the SDGs. And so we want to be sure that, we're really fulfilling one of our mandates, which is to build on any existing research initiative. And we're working also in partnership with CRIS, which is the Center for Research and Innovation Support, to be able to execute our engagement process. So with that, I'll say thank you, and I look forward to sharing more with you in the future once we're further in the development process.
Thank you so much, Nakota. That was so wonderful to hear about all this amazing work that you're leading. I will move straight ahead to our next speaker, Simon Pratt. So Simon received a bachelor's degree in chemistry from the University of East Anglia in the UK, and a master's degree in electronic communications from University College London. Prior to working at U of T, Simon worked for 17 years for Thomas Reuters Clarivate in various roles relating to the evaluation of research. And during that time, Simon headed projects to produce the Times Higher Education World University Rankings and the US News and World Report Best Global Universities. Simon joined the University of Toronto in 2015, and in the summer of 2021, he joined the Office of the Vice President, Research and Innovation as the Director of Research Strategy and Excellence. Simon's primary responsibilities relate to the university's interactions with ranking agencies and working across the university's division to promote research excellence. Today, Simon will be discussing the SDG Conceptual Report and U of T's continued participation in Times Higher Education Impact Rankings. Over to you, Simon.
Thank you. Hopefully you can see my slides. So I shall actually be talking a little bit in reverse order. First, I'm going to talk about the impact rankings and then about the SDG report. So in 2018, Times Higher Education, also known as THE, announced their impact ranking, which was based on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And in April 2019, the first rankings were published. Initially, they were based on just 11 SDGs, but now include all 17. And in their inaugural year, only 460 universities participated, but last year there were 1,240. So it's grown a lot over the last few years. Many prestigious institutions are absent. I think of the top 25 in the world, only U of T actually participates. So many of those institutions like Harvard and Cambridge and Oxford and institutions like that don't participate in the impact rankings. As I mentioned, now they rank all 17 SDGs, but there's actually 18 rankings because they, in addition to a ranking for each SDG, they also have an overall ranking. And this is based on an aggregation of the top 3 SDGs for each university, plus the compulsory SDG 17. So how do they develop the ranking? Well, they have 3 different types of data that they use to base the ranking upon. And this varies from SDG to SDG, but roughly there's like a third for each category of data. First is quantitative data about the university's activities. And you can see some examples here, like the number of graduates in the healthcare sector, what proportion of the leadership are women, what proportion of the energy usage comes from low carbon sources, and so forth. Then they also have yes/no questions about the university's policies and activities. For example, does your university have a policy on non-discrimination for transgender people? Does your university plant landscapes to minimize water usage? And for each of those, you are also required to provide evidence to support that you actually are doing that particular policy or activity. And the third piece is data based on the research publications affiliated with the university, and those are categorized by the SDG using a set of complex keywords to assign each paper to one or more SDGs. And the data for that particular piece is provided by THE's partner, Elsevier. So how does U of T do in the impact rankings? The actual submission of the data is quite a burden. It's not a simple process. For each of the SDGs, there's tens of different data points that have to be researched and completed. And our initial research suggested that we wouldn't actually do very well in some of the SDGs. And so it was really not a valuable use of our time to try to do all 17 SDGs. And in 2021, we only participated in 12 of them. We were ranked 34th in the world overall. That's down from 28th in 2020 and 31st in 2019. And a lot of the reason why we went down was because the number of universities that are participating has increased. And so new universities join the ranking, who are ranked more highly than us, and therefore we go down a little bit. Some highlights among the SDGs that we do submit to. So we're joint first in the world for industry, innovation and infrastructure, 24th in the world for that all-important SDG 17 partnerships for the goals, 35th in responsible consumption and production, 44th for clean water and sanitation, and 48th for decent work and economic growth. Now, to my mind, what's missing, we don't do particularly well in SDG 3 and 4 around healthcare and education, which are two very strong strengths of the university. And this is really a reflection a little bit of some of the methodology that Times Higher Education uses that doesn't necessarily reward institutions that do very broad teaching and research, such as U of T, and tends to reward institutions that are very focused on specific missions. Overall, we were 4th in Canada behind Queen's, UBC and McMaster. And for this year's ranking, we've already submitted the data and we've added SDG 10. So now we participate in 13 SDGs. You can see which ones there. And as I mentioned earlier, the submission's quite a challenge. So it's not just me beavering away. There's a whole group of people that work on the submission, including the Office of the Vice President, Research and Innovation, the Sustainability Office, the Institutional Research Team, the Provost Office, and of course the Committee on the Environment, Climate Change and Sustainability. And thank you to all of the people that contributed this year. In total, the submission was 47 pages long, and the results will be published in late April. Well, after the release of the inaugural impact ranking in 2019, it was clear that U of T's lack of an SDG report was a significant factor in a relatively low ranking position. And so later in that year, primarily for purpose of fulfilling the THE requirement, but also to help promote SDG awareness at the university, we developed a conceptual SDG report. And I'm going to show you some screenshots in just a minute. Each of the SDGs follows the same template. And so we're providing information and data about all of the various operations of the university: research, innovation, teaching, operations, outreach, partnership, and also news items related to the SDGs. So here's SDG 3, and you can see, as I mentioned, you've got sort of research and innovation up here on the top left, followed by teaching, operations, and so on. Now, we actually did quite a lot of analysis before preparing the report to identify some of these data points that you see here. So for example, how many papers were published in the particular SDG, how we ranked in the world for the number of papers published, how many research grants we received that related to that SDG, how many courses that were taught related to that SDG, and so forth. And here's another example. This is SDG 7, and it's the same structure, as you can see. Just pick on some of the other interesting things that you can see here. So, highlighting the low carbon action plan, and some of the institutes and different research and outreach organizations and partnerships that we do at the universities highlighted. It's not comprehensive. We try to pick up things that we can, but it's very difficult at an organization as large as the University of Toronto to pick up everything that we're doing across all the SDGs, but we definitely try to pick up the most interesting ones. Well, when we started doing that SDG report back in 2019, really there was only a handful of universities around the world that had fully developed SDG reports. I think in Canada, there's only 2 or 3. But today that's much more common. And I think, maybe there's 30 or 40 universities in Canada that have full SDG reports. The following slides are some examples of SDG reports from other institutions around the world. Some of them follow similar sort of design elements to the U of T report with a very sort of data-driven focus, and others are based more on sort of case stories and impact stories of the things that the universities are doing. I think our conceptual report was a great start, but it's not a formal publication of the university, and a more formal and up-to-date report is definitely needed in the future. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the other reports that are out there. This is from York University. They start off with kind of like a summary of lots of different interesting data points that are relevant to the SDGs in general. And then they go into an SDG specific section all the way through the reports. So this one is SDG 4, and they talk a lot more about some of the sort of flagship activities that they're doing with less emphasis on data. This is from the University of Manchester in the UK. Again, they sort of put up front a lot of key facts about the university that are related to the SDGs. And then they have a 2-page spread, quite similar to the U of T one, and that's not an accident. We looked very much at the Manchester SDG report when we were designing ours. They've got a 2-page spread with a combination of data and picking up the various different stories and activities that the university is doing. The next one I really love is actually from Tsinghua University, and it's a very new report, only came out a couple of months ago. And they've put a huge amount of work into it. So they have kind of like a 4-page spread on each SDG, where they've got very detailed data about all the different things that they're doing. It's very small here, it might be difficult to read, but number of undergraduate courses, graduate courses, programs, lectures on campus, research projects, publications, patents, as well as social contributions and cultural heritage and innovation, international exchange and collaboration. Lots of very rich data. They've clearly put a lot of work into it. And on top of that, they have like this sort of story-based approach to telling the different activities that they're doing related to each SDG. It's a very comprehensive report, and I think they've done a fantastic job. So that was it from me. It's a very quick summary, but hopefully that's helpful. And stop sharing. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Simon. That was very helpful and so nice to see the visuals as well from other universities. So I'll move to our next speaker, Patricia Escobar. So Patricia Escobar is a professional engineer and holds a Bachelor of Applied Science in Civil Engineering from U of T. UTSC chooses to approach sustainability through an interdisciplinary lens and is guided by the 17 United Nations SDGs. And this approach also views students as partners and seeks to incorporate the input of students whenever possible. Patricia's previous work includes managing high-performance building projects as an experienced sustainability consultant and energy modeler, specializing in environmental rating systems such as LEED and municipal sustainability standards such as the Toronto Green Standard and the sustainability metrics in the GTA. Today, Patricia will be discussing UTSC's approach to sustainability, including the 17 Rooms event they hosted at UTSC in 2021.
Thank you, Amanda. I'll just look to share my screen here. One sec. Go. Thank you very much for that introduction. Through the years, increasingly so, the university has been using the UN Sustainable Development Goals as a sustainability framework. I'm the manager of the Sustainability Office at the University of Toronto Scarborough. And just to introduce our office a little bit more, the goals of our Sustainability Office are guided by UTSC's strategic plan, which is called Inspiring Inclusive Excellence, and also the CECCS. Our goals include fostering a culture of sustainability on campus, helping to integrate sustainability with teaching and learning. And through our events and programming, we directly engage and connect our campus community around sustainability, and we look for opportunities to mobilize that sustainability knowledge on campus. So this is just a screenshot from our UTSC Sustainability Office website, and some links below, both to our website and to the UTSC strategic plan, which you can learn more. So moving on to the event, the UTSC 17 Rooms event was really centered on providing an opportunity for a dialogue between our incredible faculty and staff and students. UTSC's previous membership of the CECCS included Jeff Miller, who is our Director of Facilities Management and Capital Projects, and Professor Jim McClellan from the Department of Physical and Environmental Sciences at UTSC, and both were heavily supported this event and were involved in organizing it. Our goal was to talk about these 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals and what opportunities there might be at UTSC to advance them on our campus. This 17 Rooms event also kicked off our plan to begin an SDG event series at UTSC, where we hope to have a number of events per year to bring together our campus community in conversation around the SDGs. So some of the goals and targets of our event were as follows. We wanted to center students in this event and provide a place for them to really engage with their peers, but also our excellent staff and faculty experts about sustainability, and using the SDGs as a tool to organize that discussion. So for example, UTSC has many programs, even referring back to Simon's presentation before, there's just so much going on at the university related to sustainability that intersect with the SDGs. But not all those things might be well known to those who are interested in it. So the participants may have signed up for a specific room, interested in that topic, so they can explore and discuss, how they can get involved as it relates to our campus. This actually happened. So some students learned about our campus research and teaching farm for the first time in SDG Room 2 for Zero Hunger. So these conversations helped to mobilize that information. So our main goals were to generate the insight on campus with each other and across that staff student. And secondly, we wanted to foster an expanded sense of community. So even if there were participants not directly collaborating, they could get a sense of the range of people working on adjacent problems, learning about the puzzle pieces of what's going on. And we hope that discussing in this forum could help expedite those connections for participants, and that students would also be able to have their input, provide insight and perspective on those conversations while networking. Attending the event was also a co-curricular record opportunity for students, validated by the Sustainability Office, and each SDG was represented by a faculty, staff, postgrad or postdoctoral fellow who provided their expertise on each of the 17 SDGs. So what was the outcome? The event took place on October 27th between 2:30 to 5. Overall, we had 103 participants flock to the event, which was a great turnout. Nakota Foster, who's also on this panel, provided an introductory address and gave students some background on the ISIE so students could get an idea of how the SDGs were being included in our institution. And she also moderated the room SDG-4 on quality education. Overall, we had 17 incredible moderators from across 5 different departments across the university, which speaks to the way this event helped to connect different groups on our campus. And there were probably about 5 to 10 students per room. So students got a chance to go on that deep dive with experts and explore the topics of that SDG. Through a post-event survey, we asked students if they learned more about the SDGs through this event, and if they thought this was an effective way to discuss the SDGs and opportunities for them at UTSC. And we also asked students if they felt welcome to participate in the discussion. Most respondents ranked the event at 8 or 9 out of 10 for being a positive experience. And from our survey results, we gathered that the majority of students had some knowledge of the SDGs, and this event helped further their understanding. They also learned about opportunities on campus that are currently happening to advance the SDGs that they're interested in. That example before, for example, about the campus research and teaching farm. And actually, yes, one of our work study students in the sustainability office, who was an event attendee and volunteer, has written a blog post, which went up today on our UTSC sustainability website, to recap the event, the impact, and her experience. So she's very eloquent, and I highly recommend reviewing her perspective on the event on the UTSC Sustainability Office website. There will be quotes from our feedback survey in that post to give dimension to the students' experience with the event. So we're pleased with the feedback that we've received. So all in all, we feel like we've hit our goals we were in line with our goals to provide those opportunities for students using the 17 rooms format, and we'll be continuing with our SDG Events series aimed at staff, faculty, and students. And our next event is happening next month in March, where we'll continue to tell our story at UTSC and our impact towards sustainability using the SDGs. The next event will be a knowledge cafe, where staff will present major projects and initiatives on campus, such as the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Project and UTSC's Landscape and Public Realm Master Plan. And then they'll discuss in a panel the relationship to these projects to advancing the SDGs. And some of the moderators from the 17 Rooms event will be returning as panelists. You can feel registration for that event is open, and you're more than welcome to review the Sustainability Office website for more details about that. And of course, I'd like to make a special mention to our wonderful moderators and volunteers for the event. We certainly couldn't have done it without their participation and support, and it was really an incredible, valuable experience. So really thank you to them. And finally, I'll just sign off by saying that we're continuing our SDG event series at UTSC, and we're always looking for partners, feedback, and new ideas. So please feel free to get in touch with the UTSC Sustainability Office, myself, or Nadine Leon, who is the Office of Student Life and Sustainability Coordinator. And you can find our information at the links. So yes, thanks very much. I'll pass it over to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Patricia. That was so wonderful to hear. Without further ado, I'll introduce our last speaker, Gwen Burrows. Gwen is the Executive Director International at U of T. As part of the executive team of the Office of the Vice President International, Gwen is responsible for strategy development and for leading the team of staff implementing and evaluating U of T's international strategic plan, working in close collaboration with partners across the university. The international team is committed to driving positive change through international engagement and to contributing to addressing global challenges through research and entrepreneurship partnerships, as well as by supporting domestic and international students to engage globally. A senior leader in the research and health sectors, Gwen served in various leadership roles at the Hospital for Sick Kids before joining U of T in August of 2017. Today, Gwen will be discussing U of T's international partnerships and the collaborative work that is being done on the SDGs.
Great. Thank you very much, Amanda. I did something very radical, which is I didn't actually create a slide deck. So I'm just going to speak directly to you, and I'm really looking forward afterwards to engaging with everyone on the panel as well as with all participants. So you heard a bit about my bio and a little bit about the Office of the Vice President International, but let me just situate myself and the work that we do a little bit more. So the office is a central office within the university. As noted in my bio, it works across the university with divisions, with different faculties and programs to move forward our international engagement. And we engage with colleagues across the university in both bilateral and multilateral international partnerships across multiple dimensions: student, research, partnerships, etc. Partnerships with industry, with NGOs, with foundations. And one of the things that our office does is also develop frameworks for deeper regional engagement, building on partnerships that faculty have developed. And this means developing respectful, reciprocal partnerships with universities in the Global South, and that's an area of ongoing priority for us, as well as in the Global North, which has been probably a bit more of a constant through U of T's history. And with partners such as other universities, we seek to develop meaningful ways to collaborate on global challenges. And so we were one of the departments, one of the teams that supported the 17 Rooms event that led to the ISIE that's under development with Nakota and team. And that's partly because of that commitment to global impact and the importance of the SDGs as a framework to understand that impact within. And Patricia, so great to hear about the work that's going on at UTSC, and that the 17 Rooms model is being taken up in different places. It would be great to see that happen across U of T. So the sort of premise of the international engagement that the university undertakes is that the work we can do together will enhance opportunities and learnings for students. So that's one key area of focus for us. Lead to enhanced research, which brings in diverse perspectives, different policy approaches, data from a larger range of sites or settings, diverse populations, global challenges. So we believe that in every field of endeavor across the university, collaborating globally will enrich and enhance that research. And thirdly, to share and learn from and share with partner universities best practices on a range of issues. So perhaps not surprisingly, universities are critical actors in moving forward progress on SDGs, not just because some of the SDGs have to do with education, with health, enterprises in which we are deeply engaged, but also because of the research and the student engagement. And universities are increasingly engaged in the SDG framework, perhaps not incidentally because of the impact rankings that Simon told you about, but I think more broadly because it gives a sort of global coherence to that global engagement. And I would say U of T in many ways is a real leader in this space, particularly, and this is thanks in part to the work that CCS are doing in areas related to addressing climate change and sustainability. So one area of the SDGs. So from our geothermal redevelopment or developments on all 3 campuses, to the sustainability training, to the commitment as campus's living lab, the great work that a number of different sustainability offices do across the university. Increasingly, I would say from my perspective and my line of sight, peer institutions are turning to us to learn what we're doing right, and how they can be inspired by us. Or if they are inspired by us. And so we're really working with a set of universities towards change. In Canada, that includes, for instance, the 15 most research-intensive universities in Canada, represented by U15, who've together signed a charter for Canadian universities called Investing to Address Climate Change. And U of T was a real leader at this table and really set the bar that other colleagues agreed was critical. Internationally, U of T has been a leader in a number of different international colloquia, international alliances, and I'll cite just one that we've been deeply involved with, which is an alliance called the U7 Plus, built based on the G7 membership, but then engaging a number of nations beyond the G7, particularly in Africa. And the U7 Plus Alliance has recently committed to GHG reductions, as well as to developing pathways for all students to engage in learning regarding sustainability and climate change. And again, U of T was a real lead at this table, and my office worked very closely with CECCS on that work. So really proud to share best practices with colleagues, but also to inspire all of us to aim higher as universities and to meet our obligations as civic actors, as well as higher education institutions. U7 Plus is also committed to working together on the SDGs more generally, and that work is being led out of UCL. So these sorts of alliances become a real gathering spot for international discussion on how we can together work to contribute to the SDG framework. Sort of switching from the multilateral to the bilateral, we're also engaged through the International Office in a number of bilateral partnerships, which have as one of their themes the SDGs. So these might include anything from ISIE, which is an important partner for us in Ghana, with whom we're collaborating on health and a health collaborative network. But ISIE also has challenges all of its students to contribute to the SDGs and has some really innovative models from which I think we can learn. And indeed, their provost spoke at our 17 Rooms event back in December 2020. Manchester, who's top ranked in the impact rankings, as Simon shared, is a great partner for us. And so we're collaborating on a number of initiatives there. And Sydney, with whom we collaborate closely, I just got off a call last week where we've agreed to scope a call for proposals, for research proposals to which faculty can jointly apply, that will be themed around urban issues and their intersection with the SDGs. Last fall, we worked with Zhejiang University in China and put out a call for joint research projects on SDG-related themes as well. And finally, I would note that Carnegie Mellon University in the US is really leading on SDGs in many ways and was one of the inspirations and sort of mentors for us as we developed the 17 Rooms event back in 2020. And they're doing some really interesting work on community asset mapping within the university, from which I think we could learn a good deal more. So, you know, there's a lot of interest in SDGs globally. And we're learning from partners as well as inspiring partners in many, many ways. I would say that our challenge is really how to inspire interactions across SDGs. So it's a lot easier to have to chunk out the SDGs and speak to how we're contributing to each one of them. But those of you who've engaged in the SDG framework know that it's really about the critical interaction between SDGs that's as important as any one SDG. And you can't consider one without thinking about another, right? You can't end poverty without considering education. There's no food security without access to clean water. There's no clean water without a clean environment, etc. Right? And governance underlies all of those. Without good governance, you have a significant problem. So a lack of progress in one goal hinders progress on the others. And I think that's really the next challenge that we need to think about, is how to inspire that interaction between different SDGs and how to partner on those so that we're really making progress on all 17 SDGs. I would sort of point to the work that Nakoda shared at the beginning of this panel on the development of an ISIE around the SDGs. And I think there's really thoughtful work there about how that interaction across SDGs should be structured, and sort of thematic engagement through the ISI under development. And I think that ISI, as well as a number of other ISIs that exist at U of T, are really a great place to leverage and continue to partner globally. And so certainly something through which we will continue to be engaged. So I wanted to just sort of finish by saying there's different ways in which universities can engage in SDGs, right? We've talked about the student dimension, we've talked about the research dimension, and I've sort of spoken a little bit about universities as actors, but I think this is a really critical point. We're not just a point of intersection for education, that's clearly our mission, research is clearly our mission, but we're also civically engaged. We're community contributors, and we are part of the GTA as employers, as partners, as a community of people. So the work that U of T is doing on GHG emission reduction, for instance, certainly makes me as a staff member really proud to work here, because it speaks to the university taking its role as an actor really seriously. But I would point to things like truth and reconciliation and our own obligations as institutions, as well as individuals within the institution, as another, for instance, of how universities as actors need to engage with some of these critical issues, addressing poverty, education, gender and racial equity and equality, urban issues as a member of community within the GTA, understanding those as local issues and as SDG issues, not just SDG issues as something that happens over there that's just in a sort of global, outside our borders, but as something that's absolutely critical to our communities within U of T and within the GTA. And I would add to those issues the just recovery from the pandemic, a critical issue locally as well as globally, and one from which we can continue to learn from partners around the globe. So as we bring together critical frameworks on SDGs and how they can and should, and finally, and this is something that we've talked about a lot in the SDG ISI development, the role that we can bring as the University of Toronto to think critically about the SDG framework and how to understand it, how to improve upon it, what's missing from it, and how we can contribute to the next discussion as we move from SDGs to the next framework. So finally, through international partnership and with a firm commitment to a global mindset, SDGs and their subsequent iterations will remain a key priority for our international engagement as we continue to together globally address the challenges identified in that framework. So thanks a lot. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Gwen. That was such a wonderful presentation, and I think brought together many of the themes that the previous speakers were discussing earlier. So a great note to end on. I'm just looking to see if there are questions now in the Q&A. I don't see any yet, so maybe while we're waiting, and I see Ayoka saying, if you have a question for the panelists, please type it in the chat. Yes, we'll be moderating the chat. But while you're collecting your thoughts, I think I'll just maybe open up. This was generating so many questions for me just hearing this, your last comments, Gwen. But I guess one question that I'm thinking about is when you mentioned this community asset mapping, I thought that was really interesting, and looking to what resources and assets that we already have in the community and thinking about U of T as an actor that is embedded in the municipal local context. So one question I have how for all the panelists, but especially those who were working with students, working across different sectors, is how, how is community asset mapping something that you're using in your work, especially on the note of student participation. Student campus groups are often thinking about SDGs, maybe not in that framework, but they're thinking about these questions in a different way. So is that something you found useful, doing mapping in that way as you work on SDG projects?
I'm happy to kick it off. I don't think it's an answer to your question exactly, but it sort of picks up on the theme. When I reference community asset mapping, I think Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh is doing quite a bit of that. Interestingly, what they did is they got a number of different students to work with different communities, including in Toronto. So it helped open some doors for that last summer. Where they worked with community organizations to understand how those, and more sort of social justice or, community organizations that served the needs of more vulnerable populations within Toronto, to understand how they are within an SDG framework, maybe working towards a just recovery model from the pandemic. So some interesting papers generated by CMU that we sort of help facilitate, but not, I wouldn't go as far as saying partnered on, but an interesting model from which we can learn and which engage students as the researchers. So
I don't know if this is maybe related to what you were saying, Amanda, but I know that our sustainability office right now is just kind of starting up. So both Nadine and myself in the sustainability office are fairly new to the university, but we found that by opening up a discussion about the SDGs and kind of inviting whoever finds himself in that discussion or wants to participate in the discussion has really helped us, using the SDGs has really helped us to kind of see the system or open up opportunities to connect with all sorts of members of our campus and find out about their work in communities and things like that. So we found that the SDGs is a great way for us to kind of understand those opportunities, connect partners and things like that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but we've certainly been going about that route in the sustainability office and with the SDGs.
I'll jump in. So, we're very early in the development stage for the SDG ISI, and with regards to community asset mapping, this is something the SDG ISI will be very research focused, but I think potentially this could be something that would be integrated into some of the work that we would be doing, particularly because one of the goals or the objectives is really focused on knowledge co-production and ensuring that our students and trainees are leading a lot of the work, that we would be doing with regards to community engaged or participatory type research. So definitely, again, it's still very early, but definitely I could see opportunities with regards to asset mapping, community asset mapping being a focus of some of the work that comes out of the SDG ISI.
Amazing, thank you. I see 2 questions in the chat here from Miriam for Simon. So one is, do you think the difficulty in collecting data hinders participation from more universities in the rankings? And why do you think broad initiatives are not rewarded the same as focused ones by the rankings?
Yes, I think to answer the first question, it's true. I think the this type of data is data that institutions in general are not used to collecting. And so it requires a whole different mindset, and that's challenging for people. So yes, I think it is definitely a barrier. We do see different geographical locations have different levels of participation. So in particular in the United States, there's really not a lot of universities participating in the impact rankings, whereas in Canada, quite a lot are. So there's also some challenges there, I think, in terms of how much importance is placed on the impact rankings, perhaps how visible they are might be influencing institutions' behaviors as to whether they participate or not. But also to sort of maybe be a little bit critical of Times Higher Education, I think the questions that they ask are difficult to answer. And that's not necessarily because they've done something wrong, it's just because they're really difficult to answer. So if I think back to my presentation, you know, there was a question on, does your university have a policy on transgender rights? Well, it might well be that you've got 4 different policies that slightly address that. One might relate to students, might relate to staff, might relate to all kinds of different things. So pulling together your answer to that question, although it seems a simple question, is actually quite difficult. So that's part of the problem. And then your second question around why do I think broad initiatives are not rewarded the same as focused ones by the THE rankings? Well, there's a specific, there's some specific data that they ask for. So for example, the number of graduates in the healthcare sector, the number of graduates who are qualified to teach, the number of graduates in the legal professions. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to balance so that very large universities are at an equal footing with small universities. And the way they do that is that they take each of those different data points and divide it by the total number of students. So in the case of U of T, you know, we produce quite a lot of graduates in the healthcare sector, but we have an awful lot of students in lots of other sectors. And so we don't do very well on that particular metric. Whereas if we look at, say, McMaster University, they produce roughly the same sort of numbers of graduates in the healthcare sector as we do, but they just don't have as many students in other sectors. So we're being penalized for being multidisciplinary. And I think that that is a little unfortunate. It's an issue that I've discussed with THE a few times. But it also reflects a little bit THE's priorities, because they want to have a ranking that brings these lesser heard of institutions to the top. They can generate interesting news stories about it, drive traffic to their website and sell advertising, which is ultimately what they're trying to do. They're a corporation trying to make revenue. And so it's a complex arrangement that they've got there. They're not necessarily trying to produce the most accurate ranking in the world that reflects exactly what we consider to be important issues. And there's a conflict between perhaps what we think is important and what they think is important.
Simon, is it fair to say, certainly my understanding with the rankings is also that in some ways they want to ensure that universities that maybe don't do so well in the world rankings can do quite well in these rankings, so that they have a larger set of stakeholders, let's just say.
Yes, I think that's true as well. And in actual fact, if you look at the, I mentioned there's, I think, 1,240 institutions participated last year. The overlap is not that big with the institutions that participate in their main rankings. It's about 50% roughly, I think. So you're getting a lot of institutions who are participating in the impact rankings who would never even make like the top 500 in the World University rankings, but they see that it's valuable for them to do so in the impact rankings, which is, you know, that's great. You know, I think it's really good that these institutions are able to highlight their success, because there's many universities that do wonderful things in particular areas that aren't reflected in the broader World University rankings.
Okay, if anyone else has more questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. But otherwise, I think I'll just pick up off something you were just saying, Simon, of it's interesting you mentioned this challenge of like multidisciplinary views being valued, when, as Gwen was bringing up, like the challenge of integration is actually so central to the SDG goals, both in terms of issue areas and disciplines. So a question I think for all the panelists is like, is there an example you've encountered in some of the work you're doing that did integrate kind of more than one issue together in a generative way? And could you share that with us? And if not, maybe if you have some ideas on the horizon for how to better do that integration work.
I'll have a quick go. Maybe I'll think about it and come back to it, but I'll just share one thought that I do have was, you know, when we were going through the different sort of research publications and mapping those research publications to the different SDGs and looking at the courses and mapping them to SDGs, we found some really interesting things cropped up. So for example, the Faculty of Medicine does a lot of education, and they're doing education for preventing particular diseases like heart disease, for example. So that was quite interesting. And we were finding that, the Dalai Lama School of Public Health was also doing a great deal of work in the area of education. And it was interesting to see how these SDGs map onto the different faculties and how they don't map onto the faculties as well. But I'd also reflect that there's a danger that as you're breaking down the barriers that are there across the different faculties and divisions in the institution and looking across them in an SDG type of lens, that you're actually creating new barriers that are SDGs. And so that, I think, is something that we need to be careful to avoid.
So I'm happy to jump in with, I think we're trying to find really good themes that pull together different SDGs. And one discussion we've been having is around migration and health. I think that's a really interesting example of the intersection of so many different issues, right? What's pushing refugee crises often has well, obviously has a conflict element to it. It can have an environmental element to it. It has a poverty element to it, the health of migrants or of refugees. So there are certain things that sort of bring SDGs together, where thinking through all of those different issues and how they conspire can be a helpful way of thinking about it. So I think that's one good example.
I'll add quickly that, I mean, I want to sort of disclose, let's just say any of the topic areas that we're looking at, but one of the things that we're hoping to do with the SDG ISI is to look at broad thematic areas that would definitely bring together or highlight how the SDGs intersect, at different points. So, Gwen just gave a really great example, and that might very well be something that we explore through, as a thematic area through the SDG ISI research questions that might come out of this exercise.
Urban themes too, right? Is another one that just has so many, there are so many critical issues within an urban setting that are SDG related. So
I'll just make another comment, which is not really answering the question that you asked, but I think it just reflects the whole challenge of SDG related sort of data and stuff like that. And that's that, when you look at the Sustainable Development Goals website and what types of things are being classified within each of the SDGs, and then you look at what Times Higher Education is asking us, the link between the two is not direct, particularly when it comes to, for example, SDG 17, which is Partnerships for the Goals. And really, Times Higher Education is struggling to make that connection and asking things which are tenuous at best in terms of the relationship to the SDG. And really, that's a problem for all of us, because, the University of Toronto is a university. It isn't a country or a community. Well, I suppose it is a community, but it's not in the sense that you have with some of the things that are discussed in the SDGs. And so sort of trying to measure how the university is furthering the SDGs or having an impact on the SDGs is quite challenging. If you go to the United Nations website, they have a whole list of indicators to measure progress towards the SDGs. And those indicators aren't things that we do at the University of Toronto. They're quite different. And so how do we make that sort of relationship between what we are doing and how it's actually impacting and influencing and advancing those sustainable development goals, I think is a very challenging question.
I'm glad you brought that up, because and this also touches on something Gwen was saying before, but you're right, when we talk about the SDGs and you look at the website, and it talks about really specific targets for countries, and we talk about advancing the SDGs at university. It's what we want to be doing is, I suppose, is we're trying to make the link about our local impact, of course, as well as our international, but too, we want to be able to talk about our impact to our communities and how what we're doing in the community advances the sustainable development goals, maybe without making that leap to the global impact. It's just as important what we're doing with our communities on a local level. So I agree that there is that challenge to talk about the SDGs, how important they are, and their global significance, but also talk about our local impact. So that's a challenge we've faced as well, especially when trying to when introducing the SDGs. I think to some people it gets a little confusing to say this is SDG 2, and here's all end hunger and by 2030 or something that's on the website. But yeah, I agree that there's that challenge and that difficult balance.
I think if I could just jump in, like something I'm thinking about hearing you say this, Patricia, is also just, like how do we think of the university as embedded and as an actor, as Gwen was saying previously. And one thing I'm thinking about is staff too. Like the university is one of the largest employers in the city of Toronto. So we talked a lot about students, but maybe that's another question we could think about, like what has the role of staff been in terms of the SDGs. U of T recently divested its endowment from fossil fuels, but the pension fund is still invested in fossil fuels. And I know there are a lot of staff advocating on that front, but are there other issues that staff have brought up that feel more like they affect their lives in a kind of more in-placed way and not so abstract? Has that come up in any of the kind of consultations or planning sessions?
So there's the group that, and I'm not going to get this right, but the group that develops a lot of the U of T swag, for instance, on behalf of the university, group of really smart and committed staff who for years have been working to ensure that they're ethically sourced, that we know the labor practices of where they're produced, that these are people who are paid a fair wage if they're offshore or indeed local. So they have a whole framework around the development and purchase of all those T-shirts and all the, the different things that are sold in the U of T bookstore to ensure that we are engaging in ethical practices around that. And that was a staff initiative that's had, there are all sorts of ways that we can have an impact by thinking about what the impact of what we do is. And I think that's a really nice example of that. And I think a number of staff would be delighted to be more engaged with the SDG framework, in fact. And it's certainly something that we've had initial discussions with human resources on, just haven't got there yet, but a lot of opportunities there, I think, for how do we either highlight the good work that's going on, but also set some ambitious goals to continue to move those forward.
Mm-hmm. And I'll add that in addition to some of the operational goals around the SDGs, I think that staff also have a huge role to play in really facilitating some of those goals or aims that we have with regards to community engagement and partnerships and co-production, particularly to building that partnership model to advance, kind of addressing the SDGs with different communities. So, I know here at UTSC, as an example, the partnership office, they have a very progressive partnership model that they use and that they promote, and that's been integrated into UTSC's strategic planning document. And again, as we're working on developing the SDG ISIE, that's something that's really definitely at the forefront. And again, this is an aspect that has staff at U of T have been very, very engaged and involved in.
Wonderful. I see a few questions here now. So I'm going to combine two. One is around efforts to include alumni in the reporting that's being done. And then another question on faculty. How can faculty be more involved and become aware of how their teaching and research tie into the SDGs? So alumni and faculty is a question for everyone.
I think from a faculty perspective, certainly, and Nakota, not to put you on the spot, but some of what the ISIE development is leading and some of the consultations that will be done over the spring is one thing. The 17 Rooms event, fantastic way to engage faculty and increase their awareness of the SDG framework, as well as their engagement with colleagues with whom they can collaborate on it. And certainly I would suggest that one SDG event, SDG 17 Rooms event is probably not where we should stop. So again, so delighted to hear that UTSC has taken that up. Indeed, in our discussions this morning on the ISIE committee, there was a suggestion that maybe this needs to be an annual or, regular event that is led by the university. And certainly through our office, we are trying, in part through things like calls for funding, to raise awareness around the SDG framework. Any good researcher will find ways to fit their research project into the call for funding. So I'm a little I'm not sure how deep that goes, but it at least starts to get the awareness out there, because I would certainly say there's certain communities that are not aware, certain disciplines that are not aware of the SDG framework in the same way. And maybe that doesn't matter as long as they're committed to the same principles or they're doing good work that contributes to it. But I think it is useful to think about the overall set of goals that have been set out in the SDGs.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit as well. Back in 2019, when we started looking at, first the committee on the CCS, always forget the acronym, apologies, looked at the mapping all of our courses to the SDGs by using keyword searching, and that was a fantastic exercise to really highlight, here's where we're teaching stuff. Well, one of the next things we did there was to actually map who are the instructors of those courses, because we have that data, right? And we're able to do that. And then we also mapped people who've published papers that are related to SDGs, we can map those to the people. And so we can kind of create, for each individual faculty member at the university, right? Well, you teach 2 courses on SDG 3 and you've written 4 papers in the last 5 years, to sort of identify some of those experts within the university. And what we found was that when we did that exercise and then approached those faculty members to say, well, did you know that you're doing work in these areas? Some of them didn't know. And I think that's changed quite a bit. That was a couple of years ago. Things have moved on quite a bit. But I do think that sort of general awareness around sustainability, the larger sort of broader scope of sustainability and SDGs is a challenge at the university. Individual people, individual departments are doing some fantastic work, but don't necessarily think of themselves as doing fantastic work in that particular way. And so yeah, I think it is a challenge to raise awareness that actually you're doing relevant work and you need to be telling the story about that relevant work. I think it is a challenge.
Which is what Manchester does particularly well. I was struck. So Simon set up a meeting for us to meet with the Manchester group that does their impact rankings. And the comment that hit me was that the guy who leads this at Manchester partly is just getting people to identify what they do as a contribution and understanding how they work within a framework. And he said he got an email once from an oncologist who, is working on, treating patients with cancer, and sort of wrote and apologized and said, sorry, I can't contribute to sort of the impact work you're doing more. And he said, well, why don't you reframe your understanding of what you're doing? Because as someone who is treating patients with cancer, in fact, you're doing very impactful work. It may not be SDG related, but let's sort of understand what we do within the larger framework, rather than some of it's framing, right? I guess is the point.
That's such a good point. It's interesting, especially when, I've talked to people about getting engaged with sustainability, and I found that the SDGs are an amazing tool for that, because it highlights some, different ways people can get involved in sustainability or highlight their work as, contributing to advancing sustainable development. For example, sometimes I'll get a question, how can we be more sustainable? Do we recycle more? This, and it's like, it's not necessarily about that for you. If you're doing work related to, gender equality or things like that, health and well-being, that is sustainable. That does advance sustainability, and this is how. So I've really found that the Sustainable Development Goals just help bring so many partners into the conversation about sustainability, just to be able to help people find their place in sustainability and work to their strengths and highlight their stories that way.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the things that the 17 Rooms event really highlighted is that there's a lot of work that people are doing that's sustainability related or related to the SDGs, but it's just not labeled as such. So I think one of the things that we can probably do to draw people in, and I think we're getting better at this, is to communicate a bit better and to have those the infrastructure in place that will sort of enable people to declare their research or the work that they're doing as such and such, and make it a bit more accessible to people across all three campuses, as well as even to the general public and our community partners especially.
Wonderful. Yeah. I'm gonna bring up one. This might be our last question, but one question from Miriam. She is asking, I think this is a good way to end, maybe thinking forward. Are there any disadvantages to the SDG approach? This is something I was wondering about too. I think it's a wonderful framework to try to think holistically, but as we know, it does come from kind of a global development approach, which comes with its own critiques of being Eurocentric and forwarding notions of white saviorism. So as we're thinking about partnerships and maybe other disadvantages, how can we take those critiques seriously and generatively? And yeah, I'm riffing off of Miriam's question here and adding in my own, but disadvantages and also how to move forward from those critiques.
The one thing I'll say is, we had a conversation with the Indigenous Research Network, and they were highly critical of the SDGs for all the reasons that you highlighted just now, Amanda. One thing in particular is that, they don't recognize or appropriately Indigenous ways of knowing and knowledge. And so through the SDG ISIE, we're planning to really, focus on this aspect particularly, and we're planning to have an engagement session that's specifically designed in partnership with the IRN, to engage with Indigenous faculty, staff, and students, so that we can bridge that gap, but also beyond that, thinking about, are there other frameworks that might be better able to address some of the challenges, of development and sustainability outside of the SDGs? I mean, I think that's one of the questions that we've been asking when through the conversations that we've been having as we're developing this SDG ISI. So, there's definitely a lot to think about and to discuss on that.
Agree.
I would just add, I think the SDGs are a fantastic talking point. Once people, if they're not familiar with the SDGs and they start looking at it and they think, oh yeah, this makes a lot of sense, I really understand it. There's been a huge amount of thought put into the SDGs. They really do resonate very well, but they're not exhaustive. There are some sort of very positive things that we can do as an institution and as individuals that are not necessarily part of the SDGs, and in particular, sustainable finance is something that's not covered very well in the SDGs, and it's something that we actually do quite a bit of research on sustainable finance through the Rotman School, and is quite an important area that's not very well covered in the SDGs. But I would say, in general, the SDGs are very strong, a very strong talking point. I wouldn't say there's much in the way of negative aspects to it, in my opinion.
I would just say in the international sphere, I have a vague anxiety that it's become a little bit the talking point du jour, and maybe because of the impact rankings, in a way where not all people are thinking carefully about it, and what it means to engage, but kind of using it as an excuse. It's like, well, I do research. I mean, it's sort of the opposite of what we were just saying in terms of encouraging people to think about what they do in the context of the SDGs, but you don't want to sort of, there is a lot of thought that went into the framework, and you don't want to sort of dumb it down and just make it a kind of rhetoric without content. So I think that's something we need to continue to watch for.
Well, we are at time. I feel bad having to cut this discussion because it sounds like there's so much more to talk about. But I just want to thank all of the panelists for their time today and for the work that you've put into not just in this presentation, but since the last 17 Rooms event, and for the work you will continue to do. Thank you also to the Committee on the Environment, Climate Change and Sustainability for putting this panel together for the participants, and of course to Wendy Adams for her donation. As I mentioned at the start, the recording of this session will be made available on the event website. The link is in the chat, and if you have any questions or further comments, please do email the CECCS or any of the panelists here. I hope this will be the beginning, not the end of a discussion. And thank you so much for your participation.